So what is the self-determination theory, or SDT? The self-determination theory is a personality behavioral theory that includes factors that focus on the choices that individuals make. The inspiration for this theory stemmed from research of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation and the ideas about why people would engage in an activity for their own personal reasons versus a reward or an extrinsic motivator. It's hypothesized that self-improvement is at the basis of human nature, and giving external motivators dampens basic human function. The origins of the self-determination theory began with Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. They first introduced their ideas of self-motivation and the primitive needs of human behavior in the 1980s. The top three elements that they decided were autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Their book, Self-Determination, An Intrinsic Motivation in Human Behavior, came out in 1985. So let's break down the three pillars for this theory, starting with autonomy. So autonomy is the
feeling that a person is empowered, has choices, can initiate actions, and regulate one's own behaviors. For example, patients want to have an opinion on their treatment plan, rather than a physician saying, you need to do this or you need to take this medication. People like feeling that they have a sense of decision making. This sense of being able to take direct action results in a major part of people feeling self-determined. As behaviors become increasingly controlled by external rewards or external factors, people begin to feel less in control of their own behavior, and intrinsic motivation is lessened. Let's move on to competence. Competence is the feeling that a person can be effective and capable, especially in their own environment, and produce positive outcomes. People need to feel like they can master tasks, learn different skills, and be effective in doing so. When people feel that they have the skills they need for success, they are more likely to initiate actions that will help them achieve their goals. For example, let's say your child does the dishes for the first time. It's a mess, your kitchen's destroyed, but the dishes are done and your child independently decided they wanted to try to do the dishes today. If you give them positive feedback, saying that you did a great job, I'm proud of you, thank you for helping, they're more likely to initiate that behavior again in the future, whether it be with the task of doing the dishes or maybe they'll try the vacuuming next time. But it gives them this sense of empowerment. Whereas negative feedback produces negative outcomes. So if you scold your child and say, you did it wrong, that wasn't right, that's not the way I like it, they're less likely to feel that internal motivation and to initiate that task again in the future. And finally, let's look at relatedness. Relatedness boils down to the desire to interact with, be connected to, and care for those around you. It's a sense of belonging, which people want and is a absolute basic human need. People want to feel connected to the people around them and like they have a sense that they are with people who care about them and their well-being, so that they do feel empowered to make decisions or make choices. For example, people like to be in a community. We're naturally not self-isolating beings. So having this sense of relatedness drives that internal motivation for people to make decisions for themselves. There are a few ways to apply this theory to your practice and measure your results. The first would be the Treatment Self-Regulation Questionnaire. This focuses mostly on autonomy or autonomous motivation, so your internal motivators, and it assesses the reason for behavior change. It's generally about 13 questions on a 7-point scale, 1 being strongly disagree to 7 being strongly agree. Next would be your Perceive Competence Scale, which assesses perceived competency. So how does the patient feel about their ability to make decisions or about the healthcare decisions they're making? Smoking, for example. This questionnaire is 4 items long on that same 7-point scale, being 1 as strongly disagree to 7 as strongly agree. And finally, to assess relatedness, there are other important other questionnaire, and that assesses the need for support from others. So again, 7-point scale, graded the same way, but this scale asks questions about support people in their lives. Do they feel like they're capable of making decisions? Do they have the support that they need? And you can assess and reassess by having the patient fill out the same scale to track progress along the way. Next, let's start talking about how this theory is used in practice and has been used in multiple studies. Let's start with Desi's initial study. Desi's first study was done in 1971. It was pretty simple and straightforward, and it spoke a lot about human nature in relation to self-motivation. He asked 2 groups of psychology students to solve a SOMA puzzle cube in 3 different sessions, and then he told them it was part of a research project on problem solving. That was the first session. In the second session, 1 group was paid for each successfully completed puzzle, while the other group was not. And in a third session with the same people, neither group was paid. When Desi announced that the time was up and participants were each left in the rooms for a while, the members of the group that had been paid for the work tended to start to drift away from the task to read magazines or socialize amongst themselves, where the group that had never been paid was more likely to continue to work on the puzzles independently. Therefore, Desi concluded that the people who had been offered money no longer experienced that intrinsic motivation and internal drive, and they lost that because of this external motivator that was offered to them. The next study we're going to look at was done by Trigueros in 2019. The aim of this study was to evaluate the influence of a personal trainer's relationship on their trainee from the perspective of autonomy, support, and their style. So this study started with 324 people, 161 male, 163 female. They all belonged to a gym who trained 4 days a week with a trainer and had 1 weekly competition. The sports climate questionnaire was presented to all the participants, and it was used by athletes to report their perception on how their coaches or trainers interacted with them. For this study, the questionnaire was on a 7-point scale, ranging from 1 as false to 7 is very true. And the results in this study showed that participants had better outcomes in their sporting practice and in competition when their trainer's approach was one that promoted their autonomy and decision-making capacity and encouraged them to use those 2 things independently. In comparison, the results were negative when a trainer's behavior was seen as harsh, critical, restrictive, and high pressure, which I thought was interesting because I feel like a lot of people go to the gym to have a trainer sort of tell them what to do, but this study shows that people prefer to still have some independence and make decisions for themselves and feel like they're part of the process. Study number 2 was performed by Miller et al. In 2019, and this study was performed initially to help improve the design of the education plan of the residents in a pediatric intermediate care unit. They were finding that the residents were feeling that they weren't allowed to be autonomous. They were not having consistency amongst the patients that they were seeing. They felt sort of left out, so they were lacking relatedness during their rotations, and this study wanted to help set up a better situation for them. So the initial survey that was handed out was targeted 2nd and 3rd year residents, all of whom had rounded in the IMCU previously. Both groups received identical electronic anonymous surveys about their experience and as it related to the domains of the self-determination theory. So did they feel autonomous? Did they feel competent? And did they feel a sense of relatedness? The answer was no across the board. So the survey completion rates were 53% in the 2nd year residents and 62% in the 3rd year residents. They all agreed that their experience in the IMCU after the study was done and they were allowed to have more independence and say over their experience, that it fostered a sense of relatedness, and they were more frequently than they found in their other rotations able to be autonomous, which ended up being something very important to the residents. This study promoted a change of practice to the assignments that residents received during their rotation, just utilizing this basic concept from the self-determination theory. A few other interesting results that I stumbled upon were Houchins in 2001 found a positive correlation
between scores on a self-determination assessment for students who were incarcerated. Sarver in 2000 also found a positive relationship between scores on a self-determination assessment for GPAs of secondary students with learning disabilities. And Parker and Bulliet in 2009 found that undergraduates with ADHD who were coached using a self-determination approach were more goal-oriented and promoted their self-efficacy, and they had higher grades and confidence about their future success. During the literature review, there was a few specific populations that kept surfacing. They were pregnant women, oncology patients, and patients undergoing genetic testing. It was spoken about that the self-determination theory can really be useful for this specific set of patients, particularly with pregnant women. Women experience childbirth and they want to have control over their childbirthing process. They want to feel that they can autonomously make decisions. They want to feel like they can be supported in those decisions. So some of the literature was saying that as a provider, to really use that to help your patients have a comfortable pregnancy and childbirth process by letting them make decisions and feel empowered by those decisions. With oncology patients, that same wanting to have some control over an uncontrolled situation from a provider's standpoint, being able to just support your patients and try and give them options when is feasible. And genetic testing would be very similar to oncology patients. And next, let's look at the pros and cons. The pros would be it allows the patient to be in control. It really capitalizes on autonomy of the patients, which is easy to use in any provider-patient situation across many different practices. And it's guided by the individual patients who want to make personal improvements. So if you have a patient come into your practice who really wants to quit smoking, they already have that little bit of self-motivation, so you can use the self-determination theory to promote a better lifestyle change for them. The cons would be there's nothing to promote intrinsic motivation. So this theory is largely based on people being internally motivated and using that to promote either lifestyle change, healthier choices, or the continuation of healthy life choices and a good patient-provider relationship, but there's nothing that promotes that motivation. So that has to be there for you to be able to use this theory. Some considerations for myself as I move forward to become a nurse practitioner. Number one, I would say would be to continue to educate myself, especially on this theory. I find this one particularly interesting because it uses human nature to drive people to want to improve themselves, which is already innately within all of us. So to use that to continue to motivate my patients and help them lead healthier lifestyles, I think is really cool. I would need to pick appropriate patient populations. This is not something that would be appropriate for everyone in every situation. None of nursing is a one-size-fits-all, so I would need to be aware of who I'm choosing and use this maybe particularly in the groups that we had just spoken about, and research alternate methods to make sure I'm using my knowledge to help benefit my patients and use the correct population for different theories to promote better behavior changes. In conclusion, the self-determination theory is a behavioral change model that is deeply rooted in human nature. By promoting a patient's autonomy, competence, and relatedness, there can be improvement of overall health, both mental and physical. This theory is easy to use and can be used by many different providers across a multitude of disciplines. And here's my reference list. Thank you all for listening, and good night.